Welcome to the second series of the Astro-Insights Podcast, which is themed around women in astrology. With me on the pod for a second collab is the first of what I hope will be a lineup of amazing female stargazers, financial astrologer Christeen Skinner, who joins me to talk about the astrology of 2026, especially the upcoming mutable lunar eclipses in March and August. Many of you will remember Christeen from our chat last July about the Star of David aspect pattern and the September 2025 eclipses, which means she needs little in the way of introduction. But essentially what we aim to do this time is pick things up from our conversation about the astrology of the September 2025 eclipses, and then look ahead at the rest of the eclipses in the Virgo-Pisces axis. We'll be zooming in on the potential mundane implications of the upcoming March lunar eclipses in Virgo and the August one in Pisces, which should take us to February-March of 2027. So, Christeen, welcome back.
Thank you very much indeed. Very exciting.
Lovely to have you. I thought that since you've been on the show before, we could just dispense with the formalities and jump right in. So, as many astrologers out there will be aware, we're kind of at this very interesting liminal point in the eclipse cycle where the nodes are gradually crossing over from one set of signs to another. So in this case, they're moving from the mutable water and earth set of Virgo and Pisces into the fixed fire and air signs of Leo and Aquarius. And that's because the nodes move backwards through the zodiac. So we've had these two eclipses in Virgo and Pisces last September, which you and I kind of talked about quite extensively, particularly in relation to what's happening in America and with Trump and his tariffs and with the stock markets and that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, in February, we had the first eclipse in Aquarius, a track that we'll obviously return to again in August. But now, as we move into March and we start the astrological year, we're due to have this follow-up lunar eclipse in Virgo on the 3rd, which echoes the one that we had in September last year. And I suppose in a lot of ways, it's a refrain of the eclipse we had in March, mid-March 2025, isn't it? Just before Neptune ingressed into Aries. And of course, now we're sort of back in that place where we've just had the Saturn-Neptune conjunction on the 20th of February in Aries. And that's followed Saturn's sextile to Uranus on the 20th of January. So we're definitely feeling that shift, aren't we, into the new energy that we talked about last time. So yeah, Christina, I'd be interested on like how you're feeling about all this, what your kind of take on it is, especially given our discussion last time.
Wow. Well, the question is where to start. I'm actually going to go back a little bit because let me go back to the middle of December, precisely to December the 11th.
Okay.
Which is when Saturn and Neptune actually aligned from a heliocentric point of view in Aries.
Okay.
And so that to me was the writing on the wall for what was going to happen in February.
Okay. Maybe you could just explain for listeners who are not that sort of knowledgeable about astrology, what you mean by heliocentric alignment.
Well, we have, when we draw a horoscope for someone, we think of the Earth as being the center of the universe. And we place the planets according to with us at the center. And that, of course, means that sometimes they can appear to be going backwards. Right? This retrograde motion, which we've got now with Mercury, has just gone retrograde in Pisces.
Yes.
However, if we take a different view, and this is a very exciting one, actually, if you take what they call the heliocentric or the sun-centered view, you're now placing the planets relative to the sun. So no planet is ever going to be retrograde. They are just going round in their respective orbits. And it's a very, very exciting and very useful method of looking at anyone's chart. Because whereas with the normal geocentric chart, Mercury can never be very far from the sun, within 28 degrees. Yes. But if you're doing a sun-centered thing, Mercury could actually appear to be on the opposite end of the zodiac. So because I'm working with finance and business things, I actually want to know far more about Mercury and its commercial implications. So, and Mercury is zapping around the sun every 88 days. So it's spending about a week in each sign, which is, really good, actually.
Yes, yes.
Because you pick up a different pulse. Anyway, we're not talking about Mercury at the moment. We're talking about the fact that this extraordinary alignment of Saturn and Neptune. Now, it's extraordinary because of where they were meeting. They were meeting very close to what we call the world axis, or near 0 degrees of Aries. And had you been standing on the sun, they would have made that alignment on December the 11th. From the Earth's perspective, that didn't happen until February the 20th. And the gap between the two is a really interesting time, because this is where you get almost like the invisible writing on the wall. You get the hints of what's going to come. What we've known about with Saturn and Neptune is that people have been trying to put up smoke screens, whether or not you're talking about the Andrew Mountbatten thing, or the Epstein thing, or whatever you're talking about. You're trying to find the truth. And Saturn and Neptune is the one that is trying to evade giving you all the facts. Saturn is trying to use rules and regulations to say, no, there's nothing to see here. But we all know that actually those two planets are going to part. Saturn actually is moving very, very quickly. I mean, in the space of a month, it moves about 6 degrees. It's amazing. So once they are separated, I think the curtains are going to open and we'll see more clearly what's going on. And that brings us then to this lunar eclipse that happens next week. Now, here in the UK, they're saying that some of the Mandelson papers are going to be released next week. Over in the USA, they're talking about they're going to produce more of the Epstein files. And this eclipse is part of that story. And for me, Lisa, an eclipse marks both an ending of a chapter and the beginning of another one. The question is whether or not it's a chapter in a book, or whether or not it's the last chapter of a book, and then you get a completely fresh start. In this instance, because you and I know that the nodes are actually going to move away from this mutable axis, and they're gone by the early part of next year, we can say, actually, this is the end of a very long story, right? It's a 19-year story at minimum, and all will be clear by about this time next year, but it won't be clear by this time next week.
Yes, definitely.
Yes, it is. And as in terms of financial things, we know that whenever there's a dominance of planetary connection within the mutable signs of, Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, markets and traders generally don't know which way to turn, right? It's a bit classic, mutable, a bit messy. So because they don't know which way to turn, you get increased volatility, which tends to be to the downside, with things losing rather than gaining value.
Right. Yes, and we've seen that on the stock market recently, haven't we? Particularly the Wall Street and the NASDAQ.
Yes, and as with the ones in Taiwan and Hong Kong, you find that the way that each stock market behaves is they're like human beings. They're all different.
Yes.
We tend to focus here in the West. We tend to focus very much on what's happening in Wall Street or what's happening in London. But actually, what's going on in the rest of the world, they can be moving in completely the opposite direction to us. Completely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's very interesting to seeing which markets respond in which way. It seems to be the case that more in the West, that you're more likely to see a downturn with this increased stuff on the mutables, right? But in the East, and maybe because they barter more, or maybe they're more familiar with the idea of quick movement, they don't have the same, they don't get the same declines.
Interesting.
And really, because we've become so much of a global marketplace now, I think that you'd see the differences more clearly because we know more. You've now got markets in Shanghai and things which didn't, the Dow Jones, where you can go back over 125 years of history, right? A market like Shanghai, you've only got a couple of years, or maybe Taiwan.
Sure. And so you're feeling then about the sort of the Eastern markets with the eclipse? I mean, did you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I do. I mean, I don't know how markets are going to close today, but for example, we're coming into this eclipse. Mercury turned retrograde, in the last 24 hours. And we've also got Mars at right angle to Uranus. And so there's high probability, right? And please, you don't place any bets on this, or I cannot give you financial advice, right? But there is every likelihood that between now and next Monday, we will see a slide. We will see loss of value, right? We should also see a degree of instability somewhere. Well, we're seeing that. I don't know if you've seen the news at lunchtime today, but the Pakistan-Afghanistan border has now, I think, 274 people were killed. Right?
Oh, no, I haven't heard about that.
No, I mean, this is really very serious, because this is the potential for war between those. It's actually Pakistan against the Taliban.
Gosh, yes, it's normally Pakistan and India.
That's right. So this is different, so this is knocking everybody a bit off their axis. Right?
Yes.
But it's entirely in keeping with Mars square Uranus, right? Now, markets don't necessarily have to respond to that. I mean, they can ignore even a tsunami and what have you, but there's high probability, I would say, that even just that bit of news, which is really ghastly, right, will be enough to put that with this mutable lunar eclipse that's coming. It's more likely that, I don't know what's happening, and therefore they go to the negative.
Yes, due to sort of uncertainty. And certainly with, I mean, historically, lunar eclipses, even kind of back to the Babylonians, lunar eclipses generally was conceived of as being more negative than solar eclipses. They used to hide their kings and put substitutes on the throne and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yes, lunar eclipses, generally speaking, and certainly in my own experience of kind of doing eclipse astrology, lunar eclipses tend to either heighten emotions like a full moon, or bring things to a close, but over a 3-month period or so.
Yes, I would agree with that. Yeah, I think they definitely bring things to a close. Right? But so much depends on the actual personal chart to how much of a closure that's going to be. As I said, is it the chapter in a book, or is it the end of a book?
Yes, sure. And then, I mean, on top of that, I had a look quickly at the human design placements for these eclipses, and because we don't have Saros information with the lunar ones, and that was actually really interesting. So from a human design point of view, this March eclipse takes place in the crown center, or the crown chakra. So gates or hexagrams 63 and 64, which are all about analytical or abstract thinking and decision making. So how we make decisions, and how we hope things will go versus how they actually go. So I thought that was very much in keeping with the sort of that Virgo-Pisces energy. Reality isn't always that straightforward.
No, indeed. I mean, I'm dealing with a legal issue at the moment where the ruling has come out very favorably, right? But in order for it to now be carried out, the rules to be carried out, it is going to be necessary to go back into very detailed work over several years, over about 4 years worth of detailed stuff and records and archiving. And I think that is absolutely that Pisces-Virgo mix.
Yes, and indeed also with Mercury retrograde, because Mercury rules this eclipse with the Virgo stuff.
Yes.
Yes.
And then to discover, as we did the other day, that suddenly the passcode for something has gone missing. So that's got to be requested again. So that will delay things again, which is entirely understandable on an astrological level.
Yes.
And I'm looking at it now thinking, oh, yes, well, it'll resolve itself by March the 21st, when Mercury stations again.
Absolutely, yes. And hopefully also aided a little bit by that Jupiter trine, which is, I think, sort of playing nicely into the water stuff. Yes. We'll be back after the break. But first, here's a word from this month's sponsors.
Wondering where you can find somewhere quiet to record your podcast interview? No need to go up to London. For fully equipped private podcast recording facilities, visit the workshop in Folkestone. You can also make use of our co-working area for any podcast prep or editing around your recording time. The workshop offers flexible workspaces and real connection. If you're ready to escape the isolation of working from home, then step into the community-focused, professional environment of the workshop. Open to remote workers and all those doing it for themselves, at the workshop, come to work and make yourself at home. Work, connect and grow at the workshop. Inquire now via the website www.theworkshopfolkston.co.uk or by calling 01303 764270.
As you were sort of saying, it can be messy, it can be a little bit unclear, things may not necessarily go to plan, but then actually the alternative may turn out to be better.
Yes, and I think that brings us really, because we just had this by-election here, in
Yes.
the UK last night, and they're querying whether or not those results were fair and just.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Interesting.
I mean, really, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. They're saying there must have been some cheating.
I mean, that's right straight out of the Trump playbook.
They're definitely using the Trump card.
I mean, I kept thinking when I when I heard about all this, about the sort of Mercury retrograde, and then the fact that Keir Starmer has this, has his sun and Pluto in Virgo, and it's this eclipse sort of hits it quite clearly. I mean, I think it's at 9 in his chart, and it's 12 degrees for this eclipse.
Yep.
So, and I mean, things are not going to plan for him. He's already had his, chief advisor had to resign. There's the whole Peter Mandelson thing, which has made people questioning his judgment. And now, of course, the by-election. And so things definitely are not going to plan for Starmer. And obviously, as the leader of the Labour Party, things are not necessarily going according to plan for the government either. So
Actually, on this, though, I mean, I had a bet on, right, with my son-in-law. When we had the last general election and Keir Starmer got in, I said, he'll be gone by the last day in February 2026.
Oh, that's interesting. What made you say that?
I've got 24 hours. If he doesn't resign by midnight tomorrow night, I've lost the bet.
So what made you say that, Christine?
Well, it was to do with the Saturn. It was to do with the Saturn-Neptune at the time, and I can't remember what the chart was for the close of play, but it was the combination. It was very definitely. I felt that there was the Saturn-Neptune was going to be unfavorable for them. I thought there would be too much scandal that they couldn't stay in. And then when I saw Keir Starmer's chart, I thought, there's a lunar eclipse around there, and that'll do for him. And unfortunately, I didn't extend my bet into the 3rd of March. But we should see. Maybe I'm going to get it wrong anyway. So
maybe. I mean, the very next thing I was going to say is, of course, that the Sun and Mercury are sitting, and the nodes are sitting very close to his Jupiter Chiron conjunction in Pisces. So he is vulnerable. That moon, that Virgo moon, is sitting on his Sun Pluto, and it's opposite this Jupiter Chiron conjunction in Pisces. So he's definitely vulnerable. And I mean, we've already had the Scottish minister calling for him to resign.
Yeah. There's another gentleman today, a Labour guy, it actually sounded as though it was John Prescott from the past coming back. And he was really going for it at lunchtime today, sort of saying, well, if they'd let Andy Burnham stand, this situation wouldn't have happened. Well, I'm not actually sure that that's true.
No.
But it was certainly a very awkward thing that this guy was just so vociferous about his thoughts. And I thought, Keir Starmer's really got a very difficult 24 hours ahead of him, and in fact into next week with these Mandelson papers.
Yes. Well, I mean, a lot of this does seem to fit, as you say, with the Neptune in Pisces vibe of this very messy, boundaryless stuff around Epstein. And I don't remember Epstein's chart exactly, but I seem to remember that Neptune features quite prominently in it.
Yes, I was actually going to mention something else to you. We'll come back to that. But the other thing I was going to say to you was that the Uranus, as is going to enter Gemini properly, 26th of April. But actually, from the heliocentric point of view, it went in January. And I thought that was very interesting. From this point of view, Uranus is very often to do with politics. Gemini is, whereas in Taurus, it's very much you're either that or you're that. It's a bit, one way or the other, right? It's a fixed sign of the zodiac, after all. But Gemini says, well, we could spread this around a bit. So I thought that sometime after January, we would start to see the birth of new parties, which I think we will see everywhere across the world. It's not unique to us. But the fact that the Green Party did so well last night, because they've got, I think they got about 40% or something. I mean, they did really, really well.
Yes,
I think they have broken this whole thing of the two-party system.
I agree with you. Yes, and in fact, I think there were a couple of editorials yesterday about this very thing, that we're moving more to a sort of a Scandinavian type of government where it's sort of more about coalitions across multiple parties rather than one party that's kind of ruling at a time sort of thing, and that bipolar thing. Although, I mean, the Gemini is interesting from that point of view because obviously it's usually two. So in this sense, it's more Uranus splitting, which I agree with you. I was actually going to say to you that in Keir Starmer's chart, transiting Sedna and, of course, Uranus are squaring his natal Uranus. So there's very much that sense of he promised change, and yet here we have the Epstein scandal, yet another of these kind of subversive Neptunian type of things that is undermining his authority, and that's sort of his credibility is sort of ebbing away. Whether it was the grooming gangs inquiry or whether it was the whole scandal about accepting gifts from these various donors. So the party, you're right, Labour Party has really been dogged by these very minor scandals, but they just don't seem to be able to shake them off because there isn't a clear narrative of what they do actually stand for, which I think, again, is a part and parcel of mutable science, isn't it? They're not as clear as, say, the cardinals.
Yes, and I think this, does carry on into the beginning of next year, because that lunar eclipse in February of next year, Uranus will be exactly square the eclipse, the sun, moon. Right? Uranus will be at about 2 degrees of Gemini, 2 or 3, right? Squaring that the eclipse is at 2 Pisces Virgo. So I'm thinking this whole thing is going to be drawn out. All of these things are going to be drawn out. We're not going to get to clarity about anything really for about another 12 months. But in the process, this is also going to bring up all the things that have been hidden or not sufficiently well addressed in the last 19 years. And that goes back to the whole hacking scandal as well. The phone hacking.
Yes, and the whole Cambridge Analytica thing as well, Brexit.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Indeed. So I think these eclipses you could see as being potentially not very pleasant experiences, but actually they're opening the possibility for clearing things up.
Yes, and shining a light, because, I mean, this is the full moon, so there's very much the sense of illumination.
Yes.
Bringing into the light what was in the dark sort of before. Yes, very, very, very interesting. Well, I mean, given all of that, what you were saying about things not necessarily being allowed to come out into the light, it reminded me very much about what's happening with the Trump administration and with these delays to the release of the Epstein files and that sort of thing. So maybe we can just turn to the US for a second, because I saw that you recently wrote a very interesting blog post about this March eclipse in relation to the US, particularly Minneapolis, and you seem to be drawing out some conclusions there, which you were extrapolating to the rest of the US. So I thought maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'm just very lucky in that I had a wonderful book, but it's the Penfold book of the horoscopes of towns and cities of the USA and Canada. And when the Minneapolis thing broke, when the story broke, of course, I went to get that out. And there are 2 or 3 charts for Minneapolis, but the one that I chose to use is the seems to be the regular one, and certainly described what's been going on. And that's the 10th of July of 1847.
Okay.
And what attracted me to this chart is that it's Sun in Cancer. Right. And I was in Florida recently, and so therefore I was seeing the American news, and you could see that the people were actually taking food to the neighbors who didn't feel that they could even come out.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
it did seem to be a very Cancerian city, but it also seemed to be a place where they've welcomed a lot of people, and they have a moon Hygeia conjunction at 26 and 25 of Gemini. And I see Hygeia as being something to do with well-being, but, you know, for want of a short code, right, that'll do.
Yes.
So there it is. It's this mix. It's a potpourri of different people who've moved there, and yet they're trying to be a nurturing. And it was a very kind. It used to be a very kind city, but it also attracts trouble in that it has a Mars-Uranus conjunction.
Oh, right.
And that worked, and that Mars is in a fabulous trine to Mercury, and it worked really, really well to start with, in that when Minneapolis was founded, it attracted people who had skills, iron workers, and proper engineering skills. It worked really well there. But again, it's become a bit sort of the litmus test, that Mars-Uranus thing. It attracts a little bit of trouble. So anyway, I had this chart out, and I saw that Saturn was at 12 degrees of Pisces. And of course, I already had 12 degrees of Pisces and Virgo in my head because of the eclipses. So then as I read more, I just, as it happened, I found the chart for the act of insurrection.
Yes, which was very topical because of what happened with ICE in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that linked absolutely back onto this Saturn position. And so there you have immediately that there's the story. There's the Saturn in Pisces that's saying these are the rules we want to apply, but actually we also want to be able to bend them. I think Saturn in Pisces always wants to do two things.
Yes, I mean, Boris has got Saturn in Pisces, and I think he's the epitome of that, isn't he?
Yeah, well, I think if you think of Saturn in Capricorn as being a brick wall, Saturn in Pisces is a rope one. You know, it's got more flexibility.
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it a wall. Yes. I think David Cameron's sort of metaphor was maybe a little bit closer to the truth. But yes, yeah.
It's just a bit bendy. So I think that the Minneapolis story, I don't think is actually finished yet. Right, it's subsided, right, temporarily, but I don't think it's finished. I'd be interested to know what happens this weekend, because as I said, Mars and Uranus are in 90-degree formation, so it could be that this is another weekend of drama. I hope it's not. But,
yes,
it could be.
Well, it's true. And I mean, at the time that the ice thing erupted, I think we had a Mars-Pluto conjunction.
Yes.
So Mars is very, very active, I think, in the States at the moment. It does seem as though it's highlighting these flashpoints. So after Pisces season, we'll obviously move into Aries season, and yes, that may well be when things start to really kind of ramp up. But I thought what was so interesting was that you were making that allusion to the Insurrection Act, and of course, that was kind of mentioned by Stephen Miller when things started to go a little bit awry in Minneapolis, and then I think AOC brought it up too, and was sort of talking about how this could be used to try and somehow interfere with the midterms in America. And of course, that is sort of on everybody's minds, I think, with Trump and his mutable stuff kind of too.
Absolutely. And those midterms happen, Mercury's retrograde again for their midterms.
Oh, goodness.
So I don't hold out much hope for them. But for Minneapolis has a Venus-Neptune opposition. Venus at 2 of Virgo and Neptune at 0 of Pisces. So again, that's going to put the lunar eclipse in February next year is going to pick that up. But as importantly, I don't know if you found this, Lisa, is that when the nodes actually, even before you get to the eclipse, right, the nodes have got to go past 2 degrees of Pisces, haven't they?
Yes.
A couple of months' time. And I find that those nodal transits very often, although they're not on the eclipse itself, they actually tell you when the dramas are going to be.
Yes. And as I say, I mean, for me, these lunar eclipses tend to have a 3-month window anyway.
Yeah.
So Yes, I think the next 3 months are going to be sort of very interesting. And then moving on briefly to the August lunar eclipse in Pisces, given what you were saying about Uranus and Sedna, what I thought was so interesting there is, of course, that we get a mutable T-square with Uranus and Sedna in Gemini, and then the Sun and the Moon again in Virgo and Pisces. So what I thought was interesting there is that it picks up a couple of things that happen in Minneapolis, or that have sort of come up in Minneapolis. The first is that it takes place in the Human Design Gates 59 and 55, which are all about profound connection and altruism. So this generosity of spirit, but in a collective sense, which we did see so strongly, as you said, in Minneapolis, where you saw communities really looking out for each other, neighbors looking out for each other. And that's such a wonderful counter to this sense of isolation and this kind of disconnection epidemic that's been so pronounced over the last few years, due to sort of things like social media. So it's really bringing people together. So this is the upside. And then the other thing, of course, is that if you look at the Vandenberg-Saros series, because Bernadette Brady's ones only really work with the solar eclipses, there, if you have a look, it's part of the 138 Vandenberg-Saros series, which links back to eclipses in 2008 and 2013. So there's a strong tie to 2008 and the global financial crisis, which I do think we're seeing, for example, in the rise of populism around the world. I think a lot of that can be linked back to what happened during the global financial crisis. I thought it was so interesting that recently Michael Lewis did a retrospective of his, the Big Short. He did a podcast series. I don't know if you heard that.
Yes, yeah.
Where they were kind of going back and they were looking at what's happened since then and so on. And I mean, one of the things that really struck me that he sort of said on that was that he really makes the case, talking to other experts, that what this showed was that there was one rule for the 99% and another rule for the 1%.
Yeah.
And that sparked movements like Occupy. And I think it has led to what we're seeing with Uranus-Sedna, particularly Sedna. I think since we spoke last time, I interviewed an astrologer in Portland who is working quite a lot with Sedna, because, I was very interested. I was quite intrigued after we spoke. I wanted to know more about what other astrologers were finding. And one of the things that she said she found was, aside from the obvious link to things like abuse, which we've seen with, for example, the Jeffrey Epstein victims, she also saw a very strong link to social justice movements and to people who are kind of activists in that area. And of course, Occupy to an extent, and movements similar to it, which have now moved into political movements like, say, the Green Party and so on, I think are starting to show themselves through this Uranus-Sedna combination. So I think we seem to be at a really interesting time politically, and sort of from a, not just kind of locally, but globally, where, as you say, things are sort of coming to light and things are being revealed that maybe were always there below the surface, but then people like Trump actually say the quiet part out loud. And it does seem to spark something in people, which sort of, it almost sets off that anger that's been kind of boiling below the surface, which we're now seeing, kind of erupt through the Mars stuff,
I think you're absolutely right about this. And I mean, I'm very concerned about August, full stop. My reasoning for that is just as you've described there, but also the fact that Saturn will station square the US sun. So that doesn't look very good to me. I mean, I have a rule here that you shouldn't really say anything unless you can back it up 4 or 5 different ways. But I think this is, the eclipses, the picture around the eclipses, the signs that they're in, Saturn square in the US sun, and still actually within orb of our own, right? Because our own is 10 of Capricorn. So
Is this in the union chart?
the 1801
Okay, so the
chart, yes.
union chart. Yes,
So Saturn has got to come in to square that sun. But what we haven't spoken about, and I think is another layer of this, and this would definitely feed into the Occupy and all of those other movements, is that Chiron is going to move into Taurus, right?
Yes, of course.
Time. It's in just for a few months, a bit like Uranus going into Gemini last summer. It gave us an overture, a little hint of what was going to come. Well, when Chiron went through Taurus before, people then become aware of lack. I think that's the simple terms. They become aware of what they don't have.
Absolutely.
So it isn't necessarily a question of what they want, but what they have not got. Right? So
absolutely.
And I think when we get into August, the August thing happens just after we've had the Jupiter-Pluto opposition. The gambler's curse one, which is in July. Right? If markets do what I think they're going to do, right, you're going to have an awful lot of very, very unhappy people, right? And especially those who are slightly older, who lived through the 2008, 2007, the global financial crash, and didn't feel that bankers were ever held culpable.
Yes, to account. Yes.
Right. Then you're going to see a big move towards, well, listen, come on, guys, this is a repeat performance and this is not okay.
Yes, because it's certainly, at that stage, I think I had a pension that was linked to the stock market, and a huge amount of my pension value just got knocked off after sort of 2007, 2008. So anybody who was retiring then, or who was thinking about retiring, was put back several steps. And of course, we've seen all sorts of moves with the bond market and that kind of thing, particularly here, in the UK, which affects pensions. Yes. So yes, you're right. But I think people are already feeling that. One of the things that struck me about the news coverage for the Goreton Denton by-election was this Hannah the plumber, the Green MP. She really touched a nerve with her comments about how the 1% are bleeding everybody else dry. And I think that is sort of the root of the anger that people feel towards, first of all, the Labour Party, because they feel like the Labour Party has lost its way in terms of its values. Like, who is it supposed to represent? Is it the working people? That's its background in trade unions and that kind of thing, or is it the 1%, which they seem to sort of keep pandering to with all these sort of plans for growth, and allowing the tech bros to come in and they palantir into our NHS and that kind of thing. So yes, there's already a lot of anger around that, and I think that's why the Greens did so well, because they are sort of tapping into that through their sort of their populism. Whereas I think Reform is doing it in a much more negative way. Where they're not really offering an alternative. They're just sort of like Trump does. They're tapping into that anger to sort of feed off it and to sort of make people not vote for the usuals, but they don't actually have any solutions at all themselves to offer. So interesting you saying that about lack. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about this gambler's curse aspect.
It's a bit of a classic one, this one, is that all of us will live through periods when Jupiter is in hard aspect, like 90 degrees or 180 degrees from our Pluto. That's going to happen fairly regularly. But it's at those times when you are most likely you play with the gods a bit, right? Jupiter, king of the heavens, and Pluto of the underworld. But you play with the gods. And it may be that you buy something that is a little bit more than your credit limit, but actually you can cope with it. You know what you're doing, right? So it's not always bad, right? However, when it comes up in a country's chart, right, which again it will do regularly, right? That Jupiter opposing Pluto, it's likely to really stretch its credit limit too far and it can't pay it back. Now, this particularly matters for the USA because it's going to celebrate its 250th birthday at the beginning of July. And that's followed then by this Jupiter-Pluto opposition that's in the sky, which comes as part of its Pluto return and all of that. Whole part of the story, right? So it's very likely that it's going to run up a massive bill on its party, right? And then discover in July, oops, hold on a minute, we can't afford to pay, right? So I think that
Yes.
the hangover, and this is what troubles me with this, is because at this point, the nodes will be leaving Pisces and going into Aquarius. Now, for the USA, and I would have to stress this, people talk about the business cycle and the nodal cycle, and they see it as being share prices fall as the nodes go through Aquarius. And that is absolutely, if you track the USA over the last couple of 100 years, unless it breaks its pattern, that's what will happen again. It doesn't, you can't take that same model and use it in Japan or South Africa or somewhere. That needs a different model for that. But for the USA, right, it is likely to spend more than it can afford. It hasn't got enough money coming in to fill its coffers. Interest rates, once Jupiter gets into Leo, right, and joins Neptune also in a fire sign, they are likely to rise.
Yes, I mean, it depends on who Trump gets into the Federal Reserve.
Indeed, it does. But taking personalities and things aside, if history repeats, right, this is what we're looking at. And we're looking at some really ugly stuff, most likely in August and going into September. It's a storm, right? And we know what happens with storms pass, right? So nobody should sort of think it's the end of the world, but it's not looking very healthy. And if you are trading in that area, you should be going back to your financial advisor and saying, listen, I have reason to think that things might get a little bit ugly. I don't want to take that much risk. How can we reduce my risk? How can you protect me? I might be wrong, but how can I be protected?
Well, I mean, people are already talking about that from the point of view of US treasuries and the fact that a lot of countries and companies are de-dollarizing because they don't feel as though the US is a very reliable trade partner with these tariffs that are on 1 minute and then the next minute they are declared illegal by the Supreme Court. And then the next minute Trump wants to sort of try and reintroduce them some other way. So I think there's already kind of talk around that with people saying that, are a lot of countries going to de-dollarize? Are Japan, for example, going to and China going to start selling US treasuries and replacing them with something else? And that, of course, is how the US finances its debt.
Yes.
And people were already saying this last year, weren't they?
Yeah.
When that big ugly bill was passed, when was that in June, I think?
Yes.
That this was going to give the US a huge debt headache. They were already sort of. Wasn't it into the trillions already at that stage?
It's in the trillions, yeah. I mean, the numbers are now inconceivable, really. I've been spending my time reading books about the fall of civilizations because it's really fascinating how quickly a civilization falls. I in my naive way, I thought they just sort of became decrepit and then they faded away.
Yes.
But I was reading about Syracuse and Carthage the other day.
Okay.
And these are cities that actually were gone within a Jupiter-Saturn cycle. Things that they had been the New Yorks of their time. And then suddenly they weren't.
Yes, and that's that eclipse energy, isn't it? And Uranus too. Suddenly it's there, suddenly it's gone.
Yes, and you can sort of see now that we're watching a really fast decline. I mean, for all Mr. Trump was saying this is the golden age for America, whatever. I don't see it.
No, I think this is also, I think, what's interesting about Virgo-Pisces is there's the appearance of something, and then there's the reality. That Trump seems to sort of, with the Trump show and this, I mean, he thinks of himself, I think, as a reality TV star and sort of behaves as such. But I think fewer and fewer people are kind of buying the rhetoric. The sums just aren't kind of adding up. And that's, I think, where Virgo's sort of coming in and saying, we kind of dig into the detail. It's not adding up.
It's really hard because I said I was in the States and I actually had some lunch with somebody who was a Trump supporter, and I was really and I wasn't really quite sure what to say. So I was listening to the reasoning behind this, but the reasoning was actually all based on the fact that the Biden administration had been hopeless. Right? So it wasn't actually really a vote for Trump. It was like, I don't want that anymore. Right? And because the desire for something different had been so strong, right? And they're still living on that desire for something that is better, right? They're clinging on to this possibility, which I honestly, I don't see.
No.
When I did this isn't about being right or any of that, but when I wrote the first Financial Universe book, which is 2004, I wrote in that about the collapse. I had a whole chapter about, the collapse of the USA, which I actually thought we'd start to see that from 2020. I now think that that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the collapse. I think that it's very likely that Texas and California and things might break away. I mean, there's already, there are jokey memes, but they're it's very close to the truth, where you get states that are close to Canada that are actually saying to Canada, can we join you?
Yes, rather than Canada becoming the 51st state.
Please take us. And didn't you think, Lisa, that Mark Carney's speech at the Davos thing was ever
wonderful?
Did he ever speak Saturn-Neptune to us? Right,
that was incredible speech. Really, it's a paradigm shifting speech.
It was,
I thought,
and it was absolutely. I know it happened before the geocentric Saturn-Neptune, right? But it happened after the heliocentric one, and he was definitely speaking from the gods. He's describing exactly where we're at. The old order has gone.
Yes.
And by the time to link back to what we're talking about, by the time we come back into these eclipses, I think that old order, we shouldn't mourn it because it was rotten. He was right about that. It's over, right? And we will have to start a rethink and a rebuild.
Indeed. And I think this is part of the Pluto and Aquarius sort of era that, while it was going through Capricorn, it started to sort of like reveal all these kind of rotten foundations to the system. But it wasn't until it changed signs and we had these other sort of like the Neptune shifting as well, that the illusion that everything was great began to sort of fade away. I think that Neptune in Pisces was really part of that, this veneer of everything's great.
It put a gloss over everything, didn't it?
Yes.
A very gloss.
Well, yes, but I think, people have got to the stage now where they sort of feel as though, like much like with the French Revolution, I forgot that the reason that started was a bunch of women who stormed the Bastille because everybody was hungry. They were starving.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think people get to that stage where it's like that we've got nothing left to lose. We don't care about the consequences. It's kind of like do or die now. So that's interesting.
That's really, really interesting, because if we start to think of the eclipses in the summer as being shining a light on the injustices and things, it's not so many weeks after that before Venus turns retrograde, right? And maybe the female voice will really carry then.
Well, let's hope so, Christine. I mean, I do feel quite hopeful about these, certainly the Aquarius eclipses. I think that it's sort of challenging this sort of very Leo authoritarian narrative that is so strong at the moment with people like Trump and Orban and so on. And the counterpoint of that Aquarian energy, which of course is so strongly linked to the French Revolution and this idea of the people and of the sort of the humanist movement, that man is equal before the eyes of the law and so on. And it's so interesting that we're seeing that now, for example, with Andrew Mountbatten, that he, even though he is a royal, so that Leo energy, he's being brought to account by the law and by the authorities, so by the people essentially. And so hopefully, that will start to sort of like take effect, and that in turn will allow the female voice to be heard more, because I do think there's been this, even with the Epstein stuff, this terrible sort of like suppression of the female voice and of, abuse and that kind of thing to silence victims. So I hope you're right. I really do. And I feel intuitively that may well, be the case. So yes, we'd have to kind of check back in and see in a couple of months where we are. Fascinating. Yes. Well, thanks so much for that, Christine.
You too. Anyway, stay well.
Yes, you too, Christine, and good luck with your legal issue.